Okay, so here's a quick little kind of cautionary video, something to look for on these Samurais. I'm doing a rear differential rebuild on this, all new bearings. And when putting it all back together, I kept getting a leak in one of these rear brake lines where it enters the wheel cylinder. So this is an 88.5. So if you didn't know, there's basically two brake systems on Samurais. There's the early one up to early 88, and then the 88.5 on up uses a different system. There's still, the same disc and drum kind of setup, but the easiest way to tell them apart is if you had a flashlight handy, which I just did, but now I can't find it. So this is a later system. So the later ones have one rear brake hose, the soft line right there that comes from the frame down to the axle. And then what it does is the brake fluid comes through the flexible hose to a hard line into this wheel cylinder and then back out of the wheel cylinder to the other side. So this wheel cylinder acts as a wheel cylinder plus like a junction block. The early systems have two hoses and just one to each side. And kind of the difference is on the early cars, they have a diagonally paired system. So this rear, passenger rear to driver front are on a system or on a circuit, and then the opposite, then the driver rear, passenger front. So if you lose fluid in one system, they're paired, basically two separate systems, so for redundancy. So there's a diagonal pairing on the early cars and then just a front and rear pairing on the later cars. And really, a major thing to look for is the wheel cylinders. So as you can see, this one has an inverted flare, and then this is the shape of hole for the bleeder screw. And then this one has two inverted flare holes. So this car had this one. So this is a later car, but it had an earlier brake wheel cylinder. And somehow when it came in, it wasn't leaking. Somehow just the flare end on that hard line seated in there, just by chance. But I went to put it back together, I kept getting a drip. And so my first thing I thought of was this, because I've dealt with stuff like this before. These things, being 40 years old now, who knows what's happened in their past. And if you just go to the auto parts store, say I have a Samurai and I need this part, you've got to be specific to the years. And I generally won't tell them 88.5 because I don't know if their books say that. So when I went to the store and got this, I just told them it was an 89, but that gave me the proper two hardline fitting. And these bleed, there's no bleed or screw on this, but you can just crack the top line loose to bleed the brakes. It acts the same. So it's just something to pay attention to when you're dealing with, a Samurai that's new to you or you're working on it for somebody else. Little stuff like this can get you, and obviously you don't want to play around with brakes. You got to make sure everything's perfect, especially when you're driving around in a tin can. You got to be able to stop. So that's it. There's really nothing too crazy to share on this. This is the one I did seats in a little bit ago on one of my previous videos, and it's back. And when I did the Weber carburetor, obviously I did some test driving around my block and down the road, and I noticed it was vibrating pretty good, and I assumed it was a U-joint. So when I climbed underneath checking the joints, I found that the pinion flange had a bunch of play in it in the third member. So that's why now we're rebuilding the third member. And then he also purchased a transfer case from Petrolworks that was rebuilt. This is the old one. So this was just a bone stock, and we just threw in a rebuilt one with 416 gears to get the 12% high range reduction for these 235s. So should make a pretty good difference, be able to use fifth gear a lot more. So that's it. Something to pay attention to. So, you know, if you ever have leaking coming out of the back side of your backing plate, that's something to check. Make sure it's the proper wheel cylinder. Again, you can see that top hole that's tapered for a bleeder screw. This is the early version. And then this is the late version that's got two hardline style connections, two inverted flare fittings. There's other differences in the brake systems. Like they've got different proportioning valve, some other stuff like that. Which one's better? I don't really know. I've owned both. And I don't know, they've been okay. I did have a failure on an early version car that had the diagonal pairing. And it gets a little dicey, braking hard when you have one front and opposite rear. You know, it definitely tries to pull really hard one direction. But like in a later car, if you were to lose front brakes and only had rears, that would be sketchy as well. So I guess the moral of the story is make sure everything's right, because either way, if you have a failure, it can be tough to control one of these in a panic stop. You know, if you have only rear brakes and an 80-inch wheelbase in a panic stop, you're probably going to swap ends. If you were to lose the rears and only have the fronts, you probably wouldn't even notice, honestly. I owned one once that I just couldn't get rear brakes to work hardly at all. And I mean, it wasn't really that bad, honestly, but still, brakes are important. Make sure they're 100%. Yeah, that's it. So hopefully this is helpful for people. Just, you know, the more information you have, the better. So thanks for watching.